In this video, we're going to briefly introduce the field of biomedical ethics, and then we're going to delve into the process of moral reasoning, which we can use to investigate ethical issues that arise in medicine. We can define biomedical ethics as a branch of ethics that specializes in examining ethical issues that arise in the practice of medicine, or anywhere where healthcare is involved. Biomedical ethics can be very useful whether or not you're a healthcare professional or a future healthcare professional. If you are a future healthcare professional or healthcare professional, studying bioethics can help you reason through moral issues that will arise almost inevitably. But even if you're not a healthcare professional, it can be very useful. So all of us have to make ethical decisions involving healthcare regarding either our own health or the health of other people. For example, it's a good idea, at least eventually, to create some kind of advanced directive or will. And in this advanced directive, you would need to specify what to do if you are, say, in a coma. Should people pull the plug or should people wait? And studying bioethics can really help you reason through these kinds of issues. Also, legislators make policy regarding healthcare, and studying bioethics can help us reason through healthcare policy. For example, do people have a right to healthcare? Should there be universal healthcare? And bioethics can help us investigate these issues. An exciting area in bioethics is with the emergence of new medical technology, new ethical issues are raised that we need to investigate and have conversations about. For example, artificial intelligence plays a huge role in medical ethics today, and it's only going to increase. We may develop algorithms, for example, that can make decisions on behalf of people without decision-making capacity. Well, how should we create those algorithms? Should we defer to those algorithms? And so on. So many different issues arise in biomedical ethics, and I think many people can benefit from studying biomedical ethics. So going with some of these issues that come up, there are a whole slew of issues, some of them more controversial than others. So here's just a quick list: euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, abortion is a very controversial issue, human cloning, genetic engineering or genetic selection, human research, allocation of medical resources like organs, patient rights, what kind of rights do patients have, specifically regarding privacy, privacy regarding our data, our health data, truth-telling, confidentiality, human enhancement. Is there a difference between enhancement and therapy? Conscientious objection is a big issue. Should healthcare professionals have the right to refuse treating somebody for the reasons of conscience? And how do we choose for incompetent patients, whether they be in a coma or lack decision-making capacity in some other way? So many, many different issues arise in biomedical ethics. Okay, so what is the method of doing biomedical ethics? Unlike a science, biomedical ethics isn't purely empirical. Although when we do biomedical ethics, we certainly defer to the sciences and use empirical evidence, but when you do biomedical ethics, it involves mostly the use of rigorous reasoning and argumentation. So we're going to talk about that. The method of doing biomedical ethics also involves applying moral theories and moral principles. So we'll take a look at different moral principles and how you apply those to different situations. And we'll also look at case studies. So comparing different cases and working through case studies is another method of biomedical ethics. Another part of biomedical ethics is conceptual analysis. So there are many medical and biological concepts that need to be sort of parsed and understood in a deeper way. For example, is there a moral difference between letting somebody die versus directly killing somebody? Difference between obligation and permissibility? What constitutes death? What constitutes autonomy? So autonomy is a very important concept in biomedical ethics. The idea of personhood, the idea of personal identity over time. So many of these concepts need to be examined when doing biomedical ethics because they have moral relevance. Now, biomedical ethics is a branch of applied ethics, which is a branch of the whole field of ethics. Now, there are 4 different parts of the field of ethics: descriptive ethics, normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. Descriptive ethics investigates the empirical facts of morality. So if you're engaging in descriptive ethics, you may go into another culture and sort of describe their customs and their moral codes. Normative ethics involves identifying and justifying moral norms. moral standards and principles. So this is what we usually do when we engage in moral theory. We evaluate moral action and character, trying to figure out what makes actions right or wrong. Metaethics investigates the metaphysical status of morality and the meaning of morality. So metaethicists ask, for example, whether or not moral claims can be objectively true or false. Is morality, part of the fabric of nature? Is it objectively there, or is it just a construct? And then there's applied ethics. So applied ethics is investigating and resolving practical moral problems that we face on a daily basis or we face as a society. Now, bioethics is a branch of applied ethics. It's a branch that focuses on healthcare, medical science, medical technology. So we're not going to worry about these branches so much as this branch here, applied ethics. Now, bioethics is a normative enterprise, not just descriptive. And by that I mean its project is to tell us what is good, what's bad, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. So it has to deal with norms, specifically moral norms. But there's many different kinds of norms out there that guide our behavior. So there are aesthetic norms, prudential norms, norms of etiquette, legal norms, moral norms. Aesthetic norms govern how we regard what is beautiful or aesthetically appealing. Prudential norms govern what we ought to do that's in our interest. Norms of etiquette deal with what's polite, what's not polite. Legal norms deal with the law. But moral norms are a special kind of norm. And one interesting question is, well, what distinguishes moral norms from these other kinds of norms? And there's a few different answers that we can give. Moral norms have what we can consider normative dominance. So usually moral norms override these other kinds of norms. So when moral norms come into conflict with, say, norms of etiquette, usually moral norms will rule out. So for example, if you're sitting at the table at dinner, a norm of etiquette is to be polite, not cause a ruckus or anything like that. But if the person next to you is choking, morality dictates that you get up and you give them the Heimlich maneuver. So that might not be sort of the polite thing to do, but it's the morally right thing to do. So morality sort of wins out over these other norms when they come into conflict. Now, another characteristic of moral norms is their universality. So moral principles and judgments apply to all relevant situations. So if it's wrong to lie in a certain situation, then it's wrong to lie in all relevantly similar situations. Similarly, moral norms are impartial in a certain kind of way. So by this we mean that, according to morality, everyone's interests count the same. Everyone's interests has equal moral worth. And this is kind of what we mean when we say that everyone has equal moral dignity and everyone deserves respect. So moral rules apply to everyone unless there's some morally relevant difference to which it would apply to one person but not another person. A fourth characteristic of moral norms is reasonableness. By this we mean that moral judgments need to be justifiable. If prompted, a moral judgment that you make needs to be backed by good reasons. Now, feeling and emotion often guides what we think about things and how we judge certain issues. But regarding morality, it doesn't really matter what you feel about something. You need to be able to justify it with reasons. Now, a big part of bioethics and ethics in general is trying to figure out what the right action is. So what is right, what is wrong? But there are at least three different senses of rightness. Often what we mean by rightness is morally obligatory. And there's different ways of cashing out what that means for something to be obligatory. There are different theories that ground obligatory actions. But basically what it means is that you are morally required to do it. Such that if you don't do it, then often you are blameworthy for it. So actions that are permissible are just actions that are not wrong. So you're not required to do what's permissible. It's just that it's okay to do it and you wouldn't be in the wrong for doing it. Now, supererogatory actions are actions that are good, they're praiseworthy, but they're not morally required. So if you don't do a supererogatory action, you're not blameworthy for it. It's okay. But it's still good if you do it. Now, in bioethics, we often appeal to principles in order to make judgments in certain cases, biomedical cases. And we're going to be taking a look at 4 moral principles that we can use to guide our judgments in moral cases and moral issues. Autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. I'm not really going to talk too much about the principle of utility. So let's start with the principle of autonomy. In order to understand this principle, we need to understand what autonomy is. Now, you can write books about what autonomy is, but for a quick definition, we'll just say, so autonomy is a capacity. Specifically, it's the capacity that we have to reflect on our values and then to endorse our system of values and to act on that endorsement. To put it simply, autonomy is the capacity to be self-governing. We can govern ourselves on the basis of reason. I can tell myself, I'm going to start getting up every day at 5 o'clock because I'll get more done, and then I start doing it. So that's me exercising my autonomy. So according to many philosophers, our autonomy is what makes us people. It's what grounds our inherent moral worth. So the principle of autonomy often is deemed as very significant in bioethics. It's very important to respect people's autonomy. And the principle of autonomy says autonomous people ought to be allowed to exercise their autonomy. People need to have a say in what happens to them. So not respecting autonomy could involve coercing people or manipulating people or using physical force against somebody. Now, autonomy also requires that we make informed choices. So that means that when we exercise our autonomy, we're doing this in an informed way. Now, autonomy and the principle of autonomy is very important, but it can be overridden by other principles in bioethics. So there are cases of justified paternalism, for example. These are cases in which it's permissible or even good, obligatory to limit somebody's autonomy for their own good. Now, usually cases of paternalism bear a significant burden of justification because of the importance of autonomy. The second principle in bioethics that we often use is the principle of non-maleficence. This basically says that you should not intentionally inflict harm upon others, or unintentionally. So do not inflict harm. We should not cause unnecessary harm or injury to those in our care, and we should exercise due care. So non-maleficence basically says do no harm. And that's a very important principle for medicine in particular. The third principle of bioethics is the principle of beneficence, which is similar to the principle of non-maleficence. But instead of saying do no harm, the principle of beneficence is saying do good. So we should do good to others. We should actively promote the well-being of others. So this principle is also very important in the medical profession and is often why people get into medicine to begin with, to help other people. Right, finally, we have the principle of justice. And the principle of justice has to do with the sort of public nature of certain medical cases and medical decision. And this basically says that people should be treated fairly and should get their due. And it also says that equals should be treated equally. So justice has to do with the fairness of decisions and policies. Now, it's a further question in what respects we should be treated equally. So there are different answers to that question. For example, libertarianism stresses our equal right to freedom. So we're equal insofar as we have these equal rights to freedom and ownership of property. Egalitarianism, on the other hand, stresses our right to equal opportunity. So we're equal in the sense that we all deserve equality of opportunity. And justice often is used to evaluate policies of distribution. So what is the fairest way of allocating health care, for example? Should there be universal health care? How much health care should everyone be guaranteed? And so on. So principles of justice have to do with these more public sort of questions that come up in medical ethics, and also the fairness of medical decision making. is invoked when medical decisions affect other people in particular. Now, in the beginning of my ethics classes, any kind of ethics class I teach, I like to talk about ethical relativism because many students coming into philosophy tend to lean toward ethical relativism, and I want to sort of specify and clarify what ethical relativism is and why it's problematic. Now, generally, there are two kinds of ethical relativisms. One is cultural relativism, and the other is individual relativism, which is sometimes called subjectivism. Now, these relativisms try to explain ultimately what makes actions right or what makes moral claims true or false. Now, cultural relativism basically says that a moral norm is correct if a culture endorses it. So we have the moral norm that you shouldn't have dog fights, you shouldn't hurt animals unless it's absolutely necessary, right? Specific kind of animals, at least. The ethical relativists would say, well, that norm is legitimate and justified and right just because our culture endorses that norm. All right. So individual relativism basically says a norm is correct if an individual endorses it. So when people say, when they're debating about morality and someone says, that's just your opinion, this is my opinion, whatever, that's slipping into individual relativism. Now, both of these views have some pretty serious problems. One problem is that these two views imply that cultures and individuals are morally infallible. They can't be mistaken. So if a culture endorses some moral norm, then that moral norm is correct for them. They can't be mistaken about it. Now, a more straightforward problem with relativism is that it implies that intuitively bad or horrendous actions can be right. So just so long as a culture endorses a norm, then that norm is okay no matter what the norm is. But that has some repugnant implications. So for example, there are some cultures that endorse honor killing. And honor killing is when a family member, say a father, is permitted to kill his daughter if his daughter, say, has premarital sex and brings dishonor upon the family. Some cultures, that's morally permissible. So if cultural relativism is correct, then that father is not doing anything wrong because he's acting within the confines of his culture. But surely they're doing something wrong. So there are some pretty serious problems with ethical relativism, and for the purposes of our class, we're going to assume that ethical relativism isn't correct and that there are some morally correct answers to these questions that come up. All right, so now let's get into the method of doing philosophy, the method of doing bioethics in particular. So the method of doing bioethics involves rigorous argumentation. So I want to introduce what's involved in giving an argument, evaluating arguments, and identifying arguments. So the first thing that we should do is distinguish between argumentation and rhetoric. And the difference between the two hinges on the purpose of each. The purpose of argumentation is to figure out what is true, what is correct, and we do this through rigorous, honest reasoning. The purpose of rhetoric is to persuade. So dishonesty is open in rhetoric. If all you're trying to do is persuade, then that leaves open appealing to people's cognitive biases, appealing to fallacies, and so on. So when we're doing philosophy and bioethics, we need to avoid rhetoric and engage in argumentation. So, and when we talk about argumentation, we're not talking about a verbal fight or anything like that. We're talking about reasons that support a conclusion. So the basic structure of all arguments consists in a bunch of reasons, which we can call premises, that attempt to support a conclusion. So it's best to start very simple because with philosophy and bioethics, things can get complex pretty quickly. All right, so here's the basic structure of a couple very simple arguments. We can talk really quick whether or not these are good or not. So a good argument, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises if it's deductive. But don't worry about deductive versus inductive. Let's just take a look at these real quick. If the dose is low, then the healing is slow. The healing is not slow, therefore the dose is not low. Is that a good argument? So this is a good argument. If the dose is low, then it has to be the case that healing is slow. So if healing is not slow, then the dose cannot be low. So this is actually a good argument. So what about this one? If the patient is getting better, then drugs are unnecessary. Drugs are unnecessary, therefore the patient is getting better. Is that a good argument? So this is not a good argument because it's not necessarily the case that this follows from these two premises. Now let's take a look at the basic structure of moral arguments. So moral arguments, by definition, try to establish a moral or ethical conclusion, which means they try to establish a conclusion about what we ought to do, or what's good, what's valuable, what's bad, what's not valuable. Now, all moral arguments require two things. They require a moral premise and a non-moral premise. So keep that in mind. They always need a moral premise and a non-moral premise. Now, many moral arguments have implicit or unstated premises. So when we're extracting or identifying an argument in a text, it's important to try to figure out what are the main reasons that support the conclusion, and are there any reasons or premises that are needed that are not stated. So let's take a look at a really quick example. Someone might say something like this: in vitro fertilization is an entirely unnatural process, as far from natural reproduction as one can imagine. Therefore, in vitro fertilization should not be used. Okay, so as stated, it's not a good argument, but what are the premises? There's actually only one premise here, which is in vitro fertilization is unnatural, it's an unnatural process. And the conclusion, in vitro fertilization should not be used. So notice that one problem with this is that it does not contain a moral premise. This needs a moral premise in order for it to get off the ground. So the premise that's missing is anything that is an unnatural process is bad, should not be used. So in order to get this argument off the ground, it would need to work something like this. It would have to say, in vitro fertilization is an unnatural process. Any unnatural process should not be used. Therefore, in vitro fertilization should not be used. So that will get the argument off the ground. That makes it valid, the form is correct, and then we can go in and actually see if these reasons, if these premises are actually true or false. Is it the case that in vitro fertilization is unnatural? Maybe, maybe not. Seems like it is. Is it the case that any unnatural process should not be used? That's problematic. So this is the basic way in which you go about identifying and evaluating arguments. So what we're doing here is the method of doing bioethics and doing philosophy. So as we saw in that last example, any moral argument will have non-moral premises and moral premises. So in that last argument, the non-moral premise stated that in vitro fertilization is unnatural. And the moral premise is supposed to be that anything that's unnatural, any unnatural process, should be avoided. That should makes it a moral premise. So when we evaluate an argument, we can start by evaluating the non-moral premises. And this can often involve some amount of empirical research, since these non-moral premises are usually describing some natural or empirical state of affairs. And then you could move on to evaluating the moral premises. And this is where a lot of the robust work is done in bioethics. In doing this, you often need to look at the meaning of concepts. So some conceptual analysis might be needed. So for example, the meaning of euthanasia is important when looking at the morality of euthanasia. And this is because euthanasia involves direct killing, and many argue that direct killing is worse morally than letting die or aiding death in some other kind of way. So you need to pay careful attention to the concepts that are at work in these arguments. So how do we evaluate moral premises? Since we can't do empirical research to evaluate them, how do we go about seeing if moral premises are true or false? Well, we can do this by showing how they are supported by or conflict with three different things. If moral premises are supported by moral principles, then that can help substantiate the moral premise. Remember those principles that we talked about earlier, the principle of autonomy, the principle of non-maleficence, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice. So you need to know those 4 principles because you can use those to evaluate arguments and make arguments. Now we can also evaluate moral principles against moral theories, and we'll talk about moral theories in a different video. Another way of evaluating moral premises that's very common is to see how they weigh up against our considered judgments. Now, considered judgments are judgments that we deem plausible after careful consideration and unbiased reflection. Another way to put it is that considered judgments are common moral sense. Now, these aren't foolproof. Common moral sense is fallible, but if a claim or premise goes against common moral sense, then there's something that might be wrong with the claim. So if a moral premise, for example, implies that killing puppies for fun is okay, then something is probably wrong with that premise. All right, so this is how we go about evaluating moral arguments. Now, another argumentative strategy that's used when evaluating moral premises is to use counterexamples. So counterexamples are often used to show how moral premises conflict with principles, moral theories, or our considered judgments. If a moral premise conflicts with our considered judgments, it may either be false or the person making the argument has to bite the bullet. So here's an example. Someone might argue that it's wrong to pull the plug on someone who's in a coma, and the reason is because life is sacred. So life is sacred is the premise, the reason that is supporting the conclusion that you should not pull the plug. Now, is this claim that life is sacred and therefore we should not kill it, does that have any unintuitive results? Well, a counterexample to this would show that on the basis of this reasoning, we shouldn't kill anything that's alive because we're talking about life as such as sacred. So based off of this reasoning, it should be okay, it would be wrong to step on an ant, kill an earthworm, eat meat because that involves killing stuff, or even killing plants because a plant is alive. But surely this is wrong-headed, right? So that would show that there's something wrong with this argument, with this line of reasoning, because it has unintuitive implications. It implies that we should not kill earthworms or ants, and that's unintuitive, I would say. So you would have to revise this argument so that it doesn't have these unintuitive implications. So you might say human life is sacred, and that would make the argument better. But of course you would have to explain, well, why is human life sacred but not any other kinds of life sacred? Now in bioethics we read a lot of arguments, we read a lot of papers and texts, and a good skill to develop that you'll develop here is assessing an argument that's contained in a text. And you can do the same thing if somebody's verbally giving an argument. So here's the steps that you can follow in order to identify and assess an argument in a text. The first thing you do is you study the text until you thoroughly understand it. You read through it, and often this would mean reading it a couple times because philosophy can be quite challenging. The next thing you do is you find the conclusion. Now, 2, 3, and 4 are often involved in number 1. So really what you need to do is, starting out, is to find what the conclusion is. What is it that the author is arguing? This is not always straightforward. A good paper is a paper where it's easy to identify what the author is arguing. So find the conclusion, what's the point of the paper, then identify the premises. What are the reasons the author gives that supports the conclusion? So when you read through a paper, it's good to really focus on what these reasons are. And all the other stuff is sort of the fluff that you don't have to focus quite as much on. And when you do this, you're extracting the bare bones argument, and it's good to put it in step-by-step form. So find the premises, list them out step by step, and then show how it supports the conclusion. And then you can move on to evaluating the argument, which we looked at before. All right, so that's it for this video. We've started by looking at what bioethics is. Bioethics, if you recall, is a branch of applied ethics that deals specifically with practical issues involved with healthcare and human health, generally speaking. Then we went on to look at what's involved in doing bioethics. Doing bioethics, the method of it involves rigorous argumentation and reasoning. And we took a look at how to identify and evaluate moral arguments. Remember that moral arguments, they have to contain a non-moral premise and a moral premise that supports a conclusion.